Welcome to the Paul Bourke lecture presented in partnership with the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. I'm Neil Coe and I'm the current head of the School of Geosciences, and it's great to see you all here this evening. Before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Now, our speaker this evening, Dr Sophie Webber, is a senior lecturer and ARC DECRA Research Fellow in the School of Geosciences here at the University of Sydney. Sophie's originally from Melbourne, where she completed her undergraduate studies in geography and maths and stats, which I only found out today. She did her master's and PhD degrees in geography at the University of British Columbia before spending 2015-2016 as a postdoc at UCLA. And she joined our school as a lecturer in 2017, and we're very glad and proud to have her. Sophie is an economic and environmental geographer researching climate change adaptation and urban resilience in climate change hotspots across Southeast Asia and the Pacific region. Her research examines how adaptation and resilience become economic and the potentials and limits of marketized responses to climate change. This research has been published, as you would expect, in a range of top geography and environmental science journals. And with Dr. Gareth Bryant, she has a forthcoming book entitled Climate Finance, Taking a Position on Climate Futures, which I assume today's talk ties into. Now, in 2022, Sophie received the Paul Bourke Award for Early Career Research from the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. And I just want to finish this intro by quoting briefly from the citation for that award, which notes that the significance of her research is demonstrated by the following. Awards from the American Association of Geographers and the Killam Foundation, speaking invitations, including the Fay Gale Memorial Lecture of the Institute of Australian Geographers, interdisciplinary and international collaborations, and invited editorial positions. Sophie's research contributions are marked by their innovative translational methods, including advising international and national organizations on hazards associated with climate information services, collaborating with artists, and producing radio shows to communicate widely the limits and potentials of adaptation. So, without any further ado, let's welcome Sophie to present her talk on climate finance. Welcome, Sophie.
Thanks everyone for coming. I echo Neil in recognising that we meet on stolen Gadigal lands. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you to Neil for the generous introduction. Thank you to the Faculty of Science and Social Sciences Week teams for organising this talk. And thank you to the ARC DECRA Award, the Sydney Environment Institute, the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the School of Geosciences, Faculty of Science and the Research Portfolio for their support for my research. So this presentation, as Neil notes, marks the Paul Bourke Award from the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. And so this is obviously a very generous and humbling recognition for me. And so thanks to the Academy for that support and award. But I think more importantly, I see this as recognition of a geographical approach to examining and understanding and intervening in the critical social, ecological and political economic issues with which we're currently grappling. And so this is an approach that I hope to convince you of in this talk. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, I'd like to thank my co-thinker and collaborator in this piece of work, Dr. Gareth Bryant from the Department of Political Economy here at the University of Sydney. Gareth is the most generous, creative and open of collaborators I've had the opportunity to work with, so thank you for allowing me to talk about our work tonight. So building on this collaborative research project with Gareth, in this talk I want to do two things. First, I want to demonstrate the central role that climate finance plays and will play in producing our climate futures. And then I'm going to outline what we have developed as an analytical approach for examining climate finance that highlights the opportunities and constraints that emerge when our climate futures are imagined through the lens of climate finance. So in pursuit of this goal, I'm going to first introduce our approach and then demonstrate it with 4 quick case studies. Okay. Could you have some tech? Some tech help? Okay, it's all good. So this time last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific body which aggregates research about climate change, released their Working Group 3 report about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. The report suggests that existing financial flows, which are shown in blue on the left here, are 3 to 6 times below the average levels needed now, shown in grey over here, to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. The report also finds that there are vast inequalities across different regions, as well as by sector. But the central claim of the report is that there is sufficient funding available, sufficient public and private capital to pay to halt warming. It's just not being mobilised towards this goal. Similarly, the San Francisco-based Climate Policy Institute released at about the same time their 10-year analysis of the global landscape of climate finance. And this graphic, the middle image, depicts the sources of climate finance, the tools and instruments used, the sectors, including adaptation and mitigation, in which this finance has been invested. Although they report steady increases over the last decade, they also show a needed 10-fold increase in climate finance by 2050. A few months before the release of these two reports, in late 2021, climate finance was also in the spotlight at the Glasgow Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC. Some years prior, at the Paris COP in 2015, rich countries had agreed to mobilise $100 billion of climate finance for poorer and vulnerable countries by 2020 through its newly established Green Climate Fund. But by the Glasgow meeting, it had become apparent that this target would not be met, with only $80 billion mobilised in 2018, 2019 and 2020. And for critics, such as the international NGO Oxfam, this figure is vastly inflated because it counts funding that's barely related to climate change and because it includes the value of loans which must be repaid. Instead, they suggest the actual amount of climate finance is closer to around $20 billion per year. So each of these examples are a common way of analysing climate finance, a method that we call gap talk. Gap talk includes these calculations between how much finance is needed to meet climate targets and how much finance is currently being mobilised. And this gap talk organises climate finance into formal categories that describe its source, its aim, or its tool. And within this framing, the successes of adaptation or mitigation are measured explicitly in terms of financial throughput or mobilisation. So rather than focusing on policy goals or project achievements, gap talk centres pledges and targets. Climate politics instead becomes a question of how to count climate finance and how to unlock or tap more flows. So I think these analyses tell us a great deal about climate finance flows across space, trends, and different actors and financial tools across time. But it tells us much less about the economic geography of climate finance or the climate futures that different forms of climate finance might produce. In addition, the gap talk that has dominated public debate about climate finance has focused on funds and finance like the Green Climate Fund and its failed $100 billion target. In this frame, climate finance references money that goes from developed countries to developing countries as a reflection of their commitments to the UNFCCC and on the basis of these injustices of climate change. The goal of this form of climate finance is to cover the costs of adapting to climate impacts and decarbonisation in countries which might not be otherwise able to afford it. Failure to meet the $100 billion pledge has become an emblem of the shortcomings of this international climate politics. But inertia in this area stands in sharp contrast with seismic pronouncements and transformations in finance coming not from the UNFCCC negotiations, but from the centres of climate finance, from the centres of the financial system itself. For instance, former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and CEO of BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, Larry Fink, are two of the faces of this drive. In a speech to the 2019 Climate Action Summit in New York, Mark Carney, now UN's Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, announced that a new sustainable financial system is being built. A few months later, in January 2020, no, that's outside, sorry. Larry Fink wrote that he believed we're on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. And both Carney and Fink are referring to the way that climate risk is now entering into the investment decisions of markets at the scale of trillions, not billions. These announcements were not conjured up out of thin air. Divestment activists have coordinated a sustained program of action against financial institutions such as BlackRock. As a part of their follow the money strategy of climate politics, these campaigns have highlighted the astonishing size of the fossil fuel assets under management at BlackRock and their poor record of supporting climate resolutions despite their green rhetoric. These interventions from Carney, Fink, and the divestment activists are significant for developing a critical understanding of the economic geography and political economy of climate finance. And we think so for three reasons. First, they signal that climate change is shifting global finance in ways that far exceed official North-South climate finance negotiated through the UNFCCC mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund and its $100 billion pledge. Second, they signal the dominance of a particular kind of climate finance, which is market-oriented and market-controlled. This is climate finance in the image of Larry Fink and Mark Carney. Third, they signal that climate finance is a growing terrain of climate politics, where political contestation occurs on the terrain of the financial sector itself. So to understand these dynamics in climate finance, we need an approach that goes beyond gap talk, something that spans the terrain of international climate politics and finance and climate-induced transformations in public finance, financial statecraft, and financial markets. So, we defined climate finance as strategies that mobilise financial ideas, instruments, and institutions to reshape the relationship between capitalist economies and climate change. This definition situates climate finance within the political economy of the existing financial system. All finance, from home mortgages to sovereign debt, is now climate finance. It refers not only to the role of finance in addressing or not climate change, but how climate change is creating pressures within the financial system itself. And our definition of climate finance brings together adaptation and mitigation as policy and investment domains which are co-producing climate pathways. We think of climate finance as a window and media into different possible climate futures as both an indicator and mediator of the economic geography of climate change. By indicator, we mean that different forms of climate finance and their relative significance are indicators of the balance of political economic ideas and forces that make some responses to climate change possible while foreclosing others. By mediator, we mean that actors and institutions of climate finance are now mediating how responses to climate change are reshaping and potentially transforming capitalism. And this approach to climate finance is necessary to comprehend not only the positioning of finance as the solution to climate change, but also how climate change and its politics are reshaping the financial structures and logics that dominate contemporary capitalism. So we examine 6 different positions, potentially competing, potentially overlapping, of climate finance: climate capital, climate risk, precision markets, speculative markets, big green states, and climate justice finance. Each of these are ways of taking a position on climate futures, and we mean position in several senses. Climate finance takes financial positions. In finance, taking a financial position describes how a particular trading strategy is oriented to the direction of a market. So in different forms, climate finance takes an active position that shapes the evolving financial relations of climate change. Climate finance takes an analytical position. It sees climate change as a particular kind of problem with specific goals for climate finance and how its outcomes might be evaluated. Climate finance is positioned geographically. It plays out atop existing geographies of uneven development, and it also creates new geographies. And different climate finance strategies take a political position, reflecting and programming very different power relations and modes of political contestation. So in the terminology of financial markets, traders open and close their market positions. Traders can go long or short depending on whether they stand to profit if the market goes up or down. To stretch the terminology, the 6 positions of climate finance each take contrasting long and short positions on how the relationship between capitalist economies and climate change might evolve. In doing so, the ideas, actors, and institutions that are positioning climate finance in particular ways are opening up some possible climate futures while foreclosing others. So I'm going to briefly describe these 6 positions and then give more in-depth case studies on a few of them. Climate capital is a position of climate finance that sees climate change as an opportunity for capitalist growth. Climate capital shapes climate futures through its pursuit of profitable investment opportunities and the centering of private finance, such as banks and asset managers. Through the creation of climate change-related assets, climate capital opens up climate futures that can deliver positive rates of return and secure capital gains. Examples of climate capital include sustainable investment funds or green bonds, which give a climate label to ostensibly green financial instruments. These can mobilize capital as equity or debt for much needed climate investment. But the climate potentiality of these vehicles is often poorly defined and regulated. Moreover, investment into the physical assets of climate capital, such as renewable energy, remains highly uneven. If climate capital seeks to harness the financial upsides of climate change, climate risk uses existing financial risk management practices to manage its downsides for profits, asset values, and the stability of the financial system as a whole. This is risk management of climate change to finance, rather than the management of the risks posed by finance to climate change. Climate risk initiatives include the disclosure of climate-related financial risks and the integration of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors, into investment decisions. Both seek to open up climate pathways that are orderly, smooth, and above all, market-controlled. At the same time, framing investments in fossil fuels as climate risks has given climate activists, such as the divestment movement, a new set of risky tactics to create political pressure on climate finance. Precision markets seek to make responses to climate change economic. These tools include things like the estimates of the social costs of carbon, carbon trading, and climate insurance markets, and they all envision predictable climate futures that can be incentivized with the right calculative tools. In this sense, precision markets serve important information and incentive purposes. Precision markets make the costs and benefits of climate change more visible, opening up climate pathways that are ordered by economic logics of optimality. The goal is not deep greenhouse gas emissions or transformative adaptation, but just the right balance of emissions reductions and climate damage. Speculative markets, in contrast, are an inherently imprecise position on climate finance. They promise to create big winners and big losers by engineering, both technologically and financially, green solutions. Speculative climate markets include the financing of green billionaires, climate geoengineering, and off-grid solar, each of which operate at the edges of clean tech and fintech. The protagonists, from Elon Musk to climate geoengineering, are producing climate futures through their high-stakes techno-financial bets. Yet the radically open climate positions implied by the variety of speculative market positions, these so-called disruptions, are simultaneously closed off when they serve to reproduce existing patterns of extraction, exploitation, and exclusion, usually with substantial state backing. Big green states take a position on climate change via state financing powers. Although states are essential regulators, subsidizers, bankers, and de-riskers in all climate finance positions, big green states can actively use their fiscal and monetary policy to open future climate pathways in line with political and democratically decided goals. The possibilities of public climate finance extend to state coordination of green investment and could potentially close off some of the more privatized climate futures. To date, however, big green states have largely only gone as far as greening existing forms of statecraft. As such, they remain caught between the potential to democratize public climate finance. As such, they remain caught between acting as a climate manager of last resort and the potential to democratize public climate finance and the climate futures this finance is creating. Finally, climate justice finance seeks to embed climate justice principles within finance and to directly finance climate justice. Climate justice finance places climate change in the context of historical and contemporary inequalities and works towards climate futures based on equality, freedoms, and democracy. International climate funds, calls for the repayment of climate debt and reparations, and campaigns for a Green New Deal or degrowth each have their genesis in a recognition of the inherent inequalities and injustices of climate change. But while strong on the normative claims of justice, climate justice finance remains limited by its political power, and it often reflects the power imbalances of climate finance itself, so that just demands are either subsumed into market paradigms or remain unmet. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to give a snapshot of iterations of climate finance that fit into 4 of the climate finance positions I've just described. They are first, climate resilient infrastructure as an example of climate capital, innovations in climate insurance markets as an example of climate risk, off-grid solar in rural and remote areas as an example of speculative markets, and climate debt and reparations as an example of climate justice finance. Okay, I'm going to have some water. Climate capitalists have engaged in gap talk about infrastructure generally and about resilient infrastructure in particular. The built infrastructure of energy, transport, water, and buildings will be central to any low-carbon, climate-resilient transition. But increasing demands on infrastructure driven by rapid urbanisation and climate change and current fiscal constraints mean that there is an infrastructure financing gap. The World Bank, one of these key gap talkers, estimates this resilient infrastructure financing gap to be in the order of several $1 trillion a year. Climate capitalists seek to close this gap by producing resilient infrastructure as an asset class, an investment proposition characterised by predictable cash flows and returns, natural monopolies, and longevity. The challenges of financing resilient infrastructure are particularly apparent in cities of the global south, where governments face difficulty accessing debt to finance assets in the context of urbanisation and climate change. However, while climate capitalists are apparently willing to invest in illiquid resilient infrastructure assets as an avenue for uncorrelated returns, gap talkers bemoan that very little of the hundreds of trillions of dollars currently available on capital markets is currently invested in this asset class. As a result, public sector actors are expected to step in to de-risk investments, indicating the public subsidy and necessary regulatory architecture that undergirds climate capital's investment and which guarantees returns and facilitates market access. So resilient infrastructure is often financed through public-private partnerships, PPPs, and land value capture and associated tradable development rights. PPPs are a broad collective of financing and construction strategies that share risk, reward, and responsibility between the public and private sectors to finance, build, own, and operate big capital-intensive projects. Land value capture is a financing strategy that claims future incomes from the increased value of land following infrastructure or urban development investment through tools such as taxes, fees, or incentives. These are both strategies to turn fixed infrastructure into a liquid asset. By financially engineering infrastructure to deliver an income stream, rights to those returns can be assetized, making physical infrastructure, if not climate resilience itself, a tradable and bankable asset. These financing techniques have been proposed to build resilient infrastructure to protect Jakarta from the increasing and infamous devastation brought by flooding along the city's rivers and its northern coast. The National Capital Integrated Coastal Development, or NCICD scheme, also called the Great Garuda Seawall, seeks to fortify the city's coast against floods from the sea. The social implications of this project have been troubling. inducing the large-scale dispossession of marginalised informal settlements and the destruction of livelihoods along the coast. The $50 billion NCICD project is currently not proceeding as planned, caught up in ongoing legal and corruption scandals. But, as proposed, the vast seawall would be constructed by private real estate developers as a series of private islands with commercial and residential facilities along the city's northern coast. This real estate solution was imagined to cover the cost of the climate infrastructure, with land value capture, taxes, and other revenue streams from the private development to fund the protective seawall itself. So this case demonstrates that impulses towards creating resilient infrastructure as an investable and bankable asset class reshapes climate-affected communities around the need to create resilient income streams for investors and their creditors. Diverse collectives of activists have resisted this climate capital solution to resilient infrastructure, and their wide-scale activism has been successful enough to make these assets risky for investors and real estate developers, necessitating a publicly funded, though much more modest, seawall proposal. Despite sustained investment in the preparatory work to try to attract climate capital to essential urban infrastructure in cities of the global south, this remains a niche, although profitable, opportunity for a small class of investors. Meanwhile, tensions are emerging between the promise of resilience for communities and the financial structure and institutional reforms needed to guarantee resilient returns and asset prices for investors. Okay, insurance markets. Insurance markets apply the calculative logics of precision markets to price exposures to climate risks. Insurance works by collecting individual premiums from an uncorrelated population, that is, a population who face different distributions of risk, of loss, and then making payouts to cover the losses to a subset of that population following a trigger event, or hopefully a subset. Insurance therefore collectivizes loss, spreading the negative financial impacts of a disastrous event across a population. At the same time, because it prices risk through estimates and prices risk through both the premiums paid for receiving insurance and through the extent of geographical coverage, proponents of market-based forms of insurance argue that it incentivizes measures to mitigate risks. Insurance, like other precision markets, both provides information and incentives. But is climate a problem or opportunity for insurance markets? The increasing costs of climate change looms for reinsurers, with annual economic losses trending steeply upwards over time. Solvency requires insurers and reinsurers either increase premiums, create different kinds of financial products to address new scales and sites of risk, or withdraw coverage for particular kinds of events or locations, as has been mooted in the Western US and Australia in response to forest and bushfires. Responding to climate risks, however, also offers opportunities for new insurance tools, programs, and collaborations, and an expanded portfolio of potentially insurable populations and sets of catastrophic events. Insurance-linked securities, or ILS, such as catastrophe bonds and index insurance at different scales, are illustrative of examples of emerging insurance tools against climate change. These examples show the scientific and econometric forms of prediction required and the uneven outcomes of these experiments. ILS, insurance-linked securities, or ILS, are most often made up of catastrophe bonds, or CAT bonds. CAT bonds are generally structured as 3-year bonds against exposure to a particular event, such as flooding or wind impacts from tropical storms and cyclones. Investors would receive annual payments, investors would receive annual payments and then would recover their principal only if no such catastrophe has triggered a transfer of funds to the sponsor. This asset class was first created after financial deregulation in the 1990s and has become particularly popular since the global financial crisis as a financial, because of its non-correlated nature. So it's not correlated with many other investments. But CAT bonds have only become possible due to advances in climate modelling, which have allowed predictions of future risks driven by Monte Carlo simulations. Previously, insurers had either underestimated, drastically underestimated, or been completely unable to estimate future damages from catastrophes because they're such rare events. Cat bonds, however, offer only very splintered distributions of protection, and in many instances have created more vulnerability to disasters through what critics have called a drive to underwrite to securitize. So if the profitability of reinsurance depends on exposures to disaster, this encourages more vulnerable built environments which command higher premiums and then more experiences of disasters. As with ILS, innovations in measuring climatic and environmental conditions have enabled index insurance experimentation. In much of the Global South, the last decade has seen an expansion of agricultural or micro-insurance schemes. Unlike most residential insurance, index or parametric insurance is triggered by the occurrence of a predetermined physical observation. This has particularly targeted agrarian livelihoods as a means to cultivate resilience in the face of weather and climate risks. Despite enthusiasm and experimentation, however, index insurance has not delivered on any of these terms. There are currently no commercially viable schemes. There's low demand despite consistent subsidisation from the state, and many who've engaged with these schemes remain dissatisfied with their failure to cover experienced disaster events and losses, or what is called basis risk. The result is a highly fragmented social safety net. Oh, this did not move. Did it go back?
It did.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, we saw it.
All right, here's the insurance slide, sorry. So one of the outcomes of this failure of micro forms of insurance has been an upwards rescaling into pooled insurance mechanisms such as sovereign risk pools. There are several of these globally, including the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company. While each of these models works somewhat differently, their overarching goals are the same: to collectivise insurance across a population of states who are differently exposed to climate risks, and thereby expand access to insurance and decrease the financial costs of disasters. And yet, across all the regional schemes, the payouts following disasters have not met participants' expectations, reflecting the trade-offs around regional cooperation, catastrophe modelling capacity, and the costs of premiums. Nonetheless, insurance is an inherently social and relational tool, dependent on spatial and social relations between individuals, states, and markets. In its original design, the institution of insurance itself founded these social relations as mutualities or solidarities between the insured. These mutualities are, in theory, constituted through subsidies across social class, geographies, and levels of risk, on the understanding that risks are a collective social responsibility and coverage provided universally. But the insurance of climate change and extreme events is, troublingly, renegotiating these questions of inclusion and exclusion. Off-grid solar in rural and remote areas of the developing world might seem like an unlikely example of speculative markets. However, like the big bets from Tesla and green billionaires, the financing of off-grid solar takes a speculative position on climate change and, as a result, is structured by constant searches for liquidity. Off-grid solar markets focus on the geographical and social expansion of existing ordinary technologies. In this case, the speculative position taking in off-grid solar is to leverage climate imperatives for expanding access to renewable energy technologies for rural and remote consumers in developing countries, and thereby expand market frontiers. Low electrification rates in some countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, makes off-grid solar both an economic opportunity and a humanitarian need, which promise to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Off-grid solar includes a range of physical and financial technologies. At the smallest scale, they include single solar lanterns, which were prominent in early industry expansion. Larger home systems now dominate the market as plug-and-play options for households that include solar panels, batteries, and several connection points. Solar microgrids, as depicted here, sometimes can power public services and operate across a village with individuals, households connected and businesses connected as a kind of decentralized power plant. The financial terms of these systems are also diverse, but often include rent-to-own or hire purchase payment systems. where customers place an initial down payment and regular repayments over time, after which they would then own the system. Across this ecosystem, across the industry, there's a productive codependency between clean tech and fintech, with the off-grid systems requiring mobile payment platforms and bottom billion banking in turn depending on electrification. A household pay-as-you-go model is illustrative. Such a system would require a 10 to 20% down payment, and customers would then make regular repayments through mobile banking systems. The off-grid solar company can monitor payments remotely and disconnect the system if these repayments lag. These systems are successful because they defray costs for consumers, but also due to the disciplinary apparatus of disconnection. And the streams of data they produce create credit profiles for the predatory inclusion of low-income customers. These systems have also become gateways for new consumer products and financial services. The financial models for off-grid solar have evolved over time. In their initial stages, companies were driven by kind of humanitarian impulses of graduate engineers, supported by impact investors, specialised funds, and most prominently, actually, prizes from universities. As investments have grown, financing has moved towards traditional private equity and debt and venture capital. As a result, market growth is banked by investors, facilitated by consumer credit and debt held by some of the most globally precarious customers. Stories of growth and success in this industry hide a more complex evolution. From around 2018, the industry has hit a series of speed bumps. The peculiarities of off-grid solar are important to recognise here. The assets are not liquid, there are currency mismatches, there are long cash conversion cycles, and the industry is consumer finance heavy. Ultimately, however, off-grid solar for poor customers is risky because customers cannot afford to pay the costs of the systems. Very few of the companies are profitable because the systems remain prohibitively expensive. As a result, many companies have moved to supplying bigger systems and serving wealthier customers who use the off-grid systems as a kind of backup in relatively well-connected urban areas. The social and political effects of predatory forms of digital inclusion, such as off-grid solar, are profound. The speculative nature of off-grid solar, working at an unproven frontier on an experimental big bet, has required constant expansion to new customers to solve, or at least push into the future, its liquidity problem. The outcomes of this adverse inclusion of precarious populations is not electric modernity as promised, but further exclusion and indebtedness. Off-grid solar systems are socially transformative for households. They are safer, cleaner, and more reliable. And yet the realisation of this promise is constrained by the speculative position of investors. Most companies are not returning profits, they're no longer serving poor customers, and they're producing factories full of solar e-waste. Meanwhile, states and other sources of public finance continue to subsidise the ultimate investors of off-grid solar, while the systems themselves undermine efforts towards universal state provision. The central role of concessional finance points to possibilities that international public climate finance could instead be used to reduce exploitative financial relationships and embed principles of universal service provision. For many developing countries and climate justice activists and advocates, climate change is a debt relation. The idea of climate debt references the inherent inequalities in the benefits of fossil fuel consumption and the resulting climate change effects. These are the base injustices of climate change, that developing countries got rich exploiting fossil fuels, while developed countries got rich exploiting fossil fuels, while developing countries have contributed little to the cause of climate change and are least able to cope with its effects. Moreover, responding to climate change has monetary costs, from reducing emissions while continuing economic development and poverty reduction measures, to rebuilding after catastrophic events, or investing in proactive adaptation measures. As such, the global north has accrued a climate debt to the global south. But how might this debt be calculated, and those owing and those owed assigned? From which date would you begin to measure a country's emission? What is a fair share of emissions for each country? What is the total carbon budget to be distributed? And should producers or consumers be accountable for associated emissions? In some sense, these are technical emissions accounting questions, but they're also deeply political ones, implicating the assignment of creditors and debtors and the scale of their liability for debts. Calculations of climate debts facilitate political claims based on a moral common sense that what is owed must be paid. Northern countries and international financial institutions continue to insist on the proper repayment of sovereign debts, despite their extraordinary terms and their public illegitimacy. If, according to this logic, these repayments are required to uphold a kind of moral good standing and the promises of the original loan, then shouldn't these same actors make good on their debts? These political claims are made possible by engaging in the financial logics of debt, in the words of anti-debt organisers, as a new strategy for collective economic power made possible in the age of finance and its inverse, debt. But how might these climate debts be repaid? Concerns from creditors and debtors about the abundance of debt distress and its connection to climate change has raised the potential for sovereign debt restructuring or cancellation as a means of investing in climate resilience. This restructuring and cancellation could take a variety of forms, but a debt for climate swaps have become particularly popular, promising to address unsustainable sovereign debt while responding to climate risks by restructuring existing debt obligations and their terms in exchange for investment in climate mitigation or adaptation measures. So the Pacific region is facing a growing sovereign debt crisis that is eroding the fiscal space needed to address climate disasters. According to the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, Pacific countries are easily trapped in the borrowing, rebuilding, further borrowing cycle, with debts growing and constraints on capacities to invest in durable, proactive adaptation and resilience measures. The goal is that climate debt swaps might facilitate longer-term investments and budget support. But the actual debt relief offered in these instances is limited. The swaps generally lower interest rates by a small amount or offer a longer loan tenor, but have minimal impact on overall debt burdens and currency risk and are administratively complex. More importantly, this vision for debt restructuring and climate swaps fails to invert prevailing debtor and creditor relations, to recognise debts owed from global north to south. Discussions of climate debt swaps and sovereign debt distress rarely consider what Olufemi Tewa and Patrick Bigger call the other debt crisis, the debt the global north owes for the global south for plunder, extraction and climate pollution. Climate change, therefore, provides new impetus for debt cancellation. And climate debt justice through comprehensive debt forgiveness begins a program of climate reparations. The devastating flooding in Pakistan in mid-2022 forcefully laid out the case for climate reparations and ignited a public debate about climate debtors and creditors. As the floodwaters receded and humanitarian health crises proliferated, growing debt servicing commitments throughout the pandemic and interest rate spikes constrained the capacities of the state to respond. Pakistan's climate change minister, meanwhile, argued that the country is owed climate reparations for the costs of losses and damages caused not by their own meagre contributions to greenhouse gas concentrations. These reparations, the minister argued, must finally address the root causes, a legacy of colonialism and its justification to exploit, plunder, and create the climate catastrophe that we see. Debt cancellation and debt justice are first steps towards substantive climate reparations. Working towards climate reparations requires a switching of debtors and creditors and reversal of the usual directions of conditionality in recognition of climate debts at multiple scales. However, although climate reparations does require redistribution, monetary payments for past wrongs are only the first part of a broader world-making program. So in this presentation, I've introduced to you to some perhaps more unconventional ideas, institutions, and instruments that make up the world of climate finance. The argument is that these positions are a powerful indicator and mediator of our possible climate futures. Against framings of climate finance as an autonomous driver of climate action, the message is that different forms of climate finance are products of real contestation over climate change. Each of the examples I've described show the power relations inherent to and the tensions and possibilities of the politics of climate finance. Different climate finance positions configure states and markets differently, sure, but they also invite different tactics and strategies for advancing more democratic and progressive climate finance futures. My or our own position is that climate finance must be reconfigured towards a greater role for public climate finance, combining the public and democratized potential of big green states with the internationalist visions of climate justice finance. Perhaps most importantly, this vision or this position expands the social, temporal, and spatial horizons of climate finance to recognize historical and geographical responsibilities and obligations. Climate finance is a fast-moving and multifaceted arena. The proliferation of new tools, collaborations, frameworks, and deals can be mystifying in their technical detail. And climate change is, of course, much more than a financial issue. But the coalescing of climate politics around financial questions reflects the centrality of finance in mediating responses to climate change in the contemporary capitalist economy. The upshot of our analysis is that there exists a range of positions of climate finance that imply very different responses to climate change. And the politics of taking a financial position on climate change cannot remain obscure, as climate finance plays an ever-widening role in configuring our collective climate futures. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much, Sophie, for that fantastic talk. We're going to take about 15 minutes for Q&A. And we discussed beforehand, what we're going to do is take batches of 3 questions and then give Sophie a chance to tackle those, and hopefully that will get as many voices involved as possible. So I think there are microphones ready to rove. There are. So who'd like to ask the first question or make a comment?
Hi, so you mentioned for like solar panels and that sort of area that getting funding into communities is a big problem, like with less, the developing countries. I've heard of programs that take solar panels from Australia that they're not getting enough energy anymore and they take it to Africa, and that's sort of a way to introduce the panels without having to pay for them because no one in Australia wants them. So I'm just wondering what you think about those sort of initiatives.
Thank you.
So my question, hang on, Tom, I'm just trying to, some very interesting ideas. I'm just trying to put it together in terms of, do you see this as being competing futures, or that collectively in different forms, in different proportions, these futures may help us to get to where we need to? Hopefully that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Take one more in this first round. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Webber. Your middle point on the last slide was your position on how we could reconfigure and have a greater role for public finance. And I'm just wondering if you want to comment on what that might look like in our state or country.
Thank you. Okay, Soph, do you want to have a go at those?
Yeah, so I was hoping that I would get more time to think about those answers, but they're very tricky questions. So the first question, I think I'm very pessimistic about the potential for solar panels donated from Australia to contribute to electrification and greenhouse gas emissions programs in developing countries. I hope my pessimism or skepticism about that came out in the slides. I think that's actually the least productive of any of the climate finance configurations. I think those kinds of programs undermine universal service provision and do more to help us feel good about ourselves than they do to help other people. So I think there's a huge range of problems with those. So no, I'm not particularly optimistic about that. But what we are optimistic about is what we're calling climate justice finance, which has these broad horizons for how we think about what climate finance might be. In terms of Australia, I don't know. So I'm not an Australian expert. I do work internationally, but I've just been reviewing the Australian Development Finance Review, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but which basically outlines a program of blended finance for climate resilience and decarbonisation in the Pacific and in Asia. And I think this kind of program, which is about using the state to subsidise private investment in climate activities all over the world, is fairly emblematic of the dominant forms of climate finance, right? If you think about these as kind of different balances and weightings over time, I think they are competing, although they do exist simultaneously. And I think this is deeply problematic, right? This is about using our money to subsidise private investors to invest in various kinds of climate action in places that deserve much better than that. So yeah, I don't think I'm particularly optimistic about that kind of trend in Australia. And our argument is perhaps normatively unrealistic in that we don't think there is a great role for climate capital to play in building. We fundamentally disagree with the kind of scarcity logic of there not being enough money around to pay for the kinds of climate responses that are required. We think that is a kind of lack of imagination, and we instead see a much greater role for public climate finance that is democratic and truly public, rather than just using existing public resources to subsidise private capitals or to shepherd private capital investment into various kind of climate propositions. I hope that represents my position at least, maybe if not Gareth's.
Great, let's start the second round. Yeah, please.
Do you see, in terms of future, things on the horizon such as AI, such as climate change itself, becoming more and more in our faces, and fusion and anything else that might change climate finance to be more realistic and happening?
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Yeah, thank you.
You've said a lot about critiqued a lot of the climate finance mechanisms, and you've just said that you see the public investment in developing some of these systems is, in your opinion, a good way. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what that would look like, and maybe give a country-specific example to kind of ground that a bit.
Take one more for this round. Oh, okay, 3 hands went up, so we might have to do a third round.
My question was around like boundary setting for sort of metrics around climate finance, and so we can see that like narrow boundary setting or metrics for measuring success can sort of cause externalities that were unseen or not accounted for, which can lead to sort of worse outcomes. So GDP is a bad measure of success because it goes up during wartime or goes up when people spend more on healthcare. The sort of focus on emissions within climate finance could also lead to similar outcomes where, like the solar panels, for instance, that sort of approach can lead to, what would you say? Is that something like, well, leads to sort of the use of conflict minerals and perpetuating modern slavery. And so how do we also build in broader metrics to ensure that what we're financing isn't shifting the problem, but actually solves problems more holistically?
Okay, Sophie.
I don't know anything about AI and climate change. Absolutely nothing. I don't think I've even, anyway, so I'm not sure that I can answer that in terms of how to make climate change more realistic. I'm sorry. But there are obviously, so these questions are asking, like, what kind of alternative exists? Like, if the existing financial arrangements of climate finance are unsatisfactory, what opportunities exist? And I think that one of the things that we wanted to do in this project, or at least that I wanted to do in this project, was not lay out like 5 bad things and this is what we must do instead. The goal here is to say each of these positions, they all exist, right? They exist and they have different kinds of, they have different, they have more power over time and in different kinds of places. So, but each of them also invite different kinds of responses and opportunities for contestation. And so while it might seem really surprising to think that climate risk actually offers a whole bunch of opportunities for activism, but actually that kind of framing has created opportunities for engagement that make fossil fuel investment really risky throughout a whole, through a whole financial ecosystem, right? And so it's not to say that we need to pursue climate risk because of this fact, but that there are opportunities for us to engage within that system. And so I can't remember was someone over here who asked about examples of how this has worked. Up there, sorry. So like the example of the Adani campaign, which is largely fought on the terrain of finance, produced that as a risky investment for a whole series of different kinds of financial institutions, right? Hasn't stopped the expansion hasn't stopped that expansion, but it has created that as a risky investment opportunity. And the Jakarta example is the same. The scale of the seawall and the scale, because it was such a huge project, because of the nature of it as a land value capture project, created opportunity for political engagement throughout the city, which then made that a risky investment. So any kind of small nature-based solution or small localized seawall, which you might think of being like more progressive than a big seawall, would never produce that kind of political response. So the scale of the finance is actually what is responsible for the kind of political engagement. So I presented about climate debt. That might not be something that is necessarily you would think of when you're thinking about climate finance, but I think this is a really capacious demand. And I'm really interested in this as something that invites new kinds of opportunities for engagement that aren't local, right? That take us far beyond what Australia is doing or what's happening in Sydney, to like really far away places to whom we are connected through this climate debt. I think that's a really inspiring way of thinking about climate finance. And the logic of debt has this kind of for a debt, theorists of debt, this kind of logic of climate debt has this kind of moral and political background, which kind of demands that you exist in a financial system in relation to others, right? And so I think of that as having a ton of opportunity in terms of political engagement. So yeah, there is no prescription or answers, and that's not really the aim of the book. But the goal is to kind of lay out how you might orient yourself in relation to these different kinds of positions. So boundary setting for metrics for climate finance. I'm not sure I completely understand this question about boundary setting. At first, I thought you were asking me about how we count climate finance, which is one of the things that frustrates me most about gap talk, right? That climate politics becomes obsessed with how you count climate finance rather than what this funding is actually being used for. And so that's a kind of mode of boundary setting, I think, that is really dominates climate finance. Is this new and additional to that existing ODA? What proportion of this project is actually related to climate change? These are the things that people become obsessed with when they're gap talkers talking about how much money we actually need to respond to climate change. Completely ignores what any of that money is actually doing or what's actually investing in. So yeah, I think obviously there's a range of externalities in your words to climate proposals, but that is the one that most frustrates me in terms of boundary setting.
Got energy for one more round?
Yes.
Okay, one more round. Sure. And then we'll have drinks and nibbles. Okay, there were 2 questions here before. David, I think you had one, and yeah. And we'll take one other one. Okay, there's the 3. Okay.
Thanks for your talk. The financial sector hasn't covered itself in glory since 2008, and even in more recent times in terms of climate-based markets. We have a look at the lack of integrity in the carbon offsets, carbon credits market, particularly under the previous government, where trees weren't even been growing, trees were already there, but we're going to pay you, get money for that too, or a whole swathe, you know, all of those sorts of things. Even things like using like a market index, like even when you look at interest rate differentials, like the LIBOR index, you know, people in there trying to manipulate everything. Are you confident, so the question is, are you confident that governments will be able to ensure integrity in these sorts of areas so that we don't have big busts that have to be bailed out by governments, like, for example, in the global financial crisis with contracts for difference in the States. And that was off a product that was pretty well, but better known than this stuff is. So, you know, like it's more tangible. So, and what's the basis of your confidence, if so?
Take this one while the microphone comes to David. Yeah.
So I was wondering, with the whole climate justice finance and ideas like degrowth and that whole area, there's, I guess, a lot of pessimism around those ideas, and I guess particularly because they really do challenge capitalism as a system. So I was just wondering your thoughts on how you deal with that pessimism, or what are your thoughts on that in general?
Thank you. Okay, final question here with David.
Thanks. First, that's great. It's incredible to hear just the comprehensive nature of the work, and it's great to hear the evolution of it, because I heard it a while ago, so thanks for that. And this question may be sort of, because you're just giving snippets of the book, and maybe it's answered there, but I'm really curious about the notion of climate justice finance that you're using and the internationalist nature of it, right? That it's reparations, that it's debt forgiveness. Because there are questions of climate justice finance right here in Sydney, right? Western Sydney, heat waves in Western Sydney, and the lack of funding, or the sort of scrambling for funding for improving housing, for building social infrastructure, for just protecting people during the coming heat waves. So I'm just curious about thinking about climate justice in that way, those made vulnerable to heat, just as an example. That's local, that's not a sort of international, and it's not about reparations, it's about the scarcity question, right? And using that scarcity question to say, oh, we don't have the money to pay for that. So just curious about using that climate justice finance argument in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I think what I was being asked about is there a kind of climate finance bubble? This is totally Gareth's terrain and not my, not my terrain. I think that this has been referred to by financial actors as a potential for a kind of correlated climate Minsky moment, if I'm getting this right, the potential for large-scale devaluations in climate assets and other kinds of highly correlated, I don't know, transformations in the financial sector. So what am I confident that governments can ensure integrity in these markets? Like, no. Obviously, no. Evidence suggests absolutely no. But I think that's a political question, not a technical question. That's a question about, like, us as citizens and our relationship to states who govern these markets, right? And so, you know, if this becomes a political question that we take up as citizens, then why would we not trust them as governments to regulate this sector, right? That's a claim that you can make on your state collectively, and I hope that we do so, right? So expanding our imagination about what states can do in response to the financial sector. So climate justice finance, I am not a degrowther, and I do not get into degrowth debates on Twitter. I'm not even on Twitter, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that degrowth does tweet about itself. So yeah, and my pessimism about degrowth has nothing to do with its relationship to capitalism. It's about degrowth. So I'm sorry, I cannot be convinced of this. So yeah, I'm really taken by the internationalist agenda of climate justice finance, but I really appreciate the way you have reframed that. But I don't see that, like, the book doesn't talk about those kinds of issues. In fact, our one, like, well, there's many things that we don't talk about for sure, but one of the ones that we were really feel silly to have missed is really related to household issues and much more localized questions. We were particularly interested in talking about household solar for a variety of reasons, which I think would allow us to get at some of the questions you're raising. And yeah, so I really appreciate that kind of offer to extend the argument and think about how, I don't know, in like old geography ideas, the global is always local, right? Yeah, so I don't have anything else to add except I agree, and thank you for the provocation, David.
Please do join us outside for drinks and nibbles, and let's close by thanking Sophie for a fantastic talk.